I'll take about not more than 3 minutes to introduce Sam and the kind of work that he's done, the book that he has come up with. Sam will take about 35 minutes to present about his book, and then maybe not more than 2 or 3 questions from my side, and then I'll open it for the audience, right? Little bit about the book. So today's conversation invites us to step back from the familiar maps and inherited narratives and to look again at the making of modern Asia, not as a single moment of rupture, but as a series of decisions, divisions, and displacements whose consequences continue to shape up, even today, political, emotional, and moral landscapes. It is therefore a very honor and it's my privilege to welcome Sam Dalrymple. His father is a superstar and very much sought after an orator. Sam is equally a popular historian, writer, and one of the most thoughtful contemporary voices working on the lived histories of partition and post-imperial Asia. Sam Dalrymple is known not only for his rigorous archival research, but for his insistence that history must also attend to memory, emotions, and human experience. Sam has spent years recording oral histories of people whose lives were shaped by borders drawn far from their homes, often. And most of his research works is on extensive engagement with partition testimonies and has already signaled his concern with how imperial decisions echo across generations. What is striking about the book, which is now come up with, is not only its geographical sweep from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but its central argument that partition was not an exception, but a governing logic of decolonization repeatedly employed by collapsing empires and Cold War powers alike. Equally compelling is the book's refusal to reduce these events to abstract geopolitics. Instead, it foregrounds ordinary lives disrupted by extraordinary decisions, families divided, homes abandoned, memories repressed, and histories selectively being remembered. This book asks a lot of uncomfortable questions. One, why did partition become such a default solution? 2, who benefited from it and who paid its price? And 3, this is my way of understanding the book. And 3, what does it mean to live in a region where borders are young, but wounds are still very raw? So this is my quick take on what Sam is and the kind of work that he's done. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Rishi. Can everyone hear me at the back there? Yes? Perfect. Next slide, please. So many of you have just come from the After Nations session by Rana, and we're going to go back now to how many of these nations emerged onto the map that we see today. And I think there's no better place to begin than this image here. There is this rumor, I think, that many of us grew up with, that you can see the Great Wall of China from space. And in fact, you can't. Even if you were to squint your eyes as hard as you could, you wouldn't be able to see a thing. And that's because there's only one wall that you can see from space, and that is the India-Pakistan border that you can see behind me here. That's Karachi on the bottom left. And on the right-hand side, you can see Jaisalmer and Barmer in Rajasthan. This is one of the most militarized walls in history. It stretches over 3,000 kilometers from the Arabian Sea, this very same sea, all the way up to the high Himalayas, where it turns into the line of control and peters out not too far from K2, the second highest point on planet Earth after Everest. And this war has been the source of much conflict. Just this May, we had a near nuclear conflict, one of the nearest we've come to nuclear war in the 21st century, with two nuclear-armed nations lobbying missiles at each other over this wall. And what's remarkable is that this is just one of many very militarized walls in the region. If you go a bit further east, you reach the longest wall on planet Earth, the India-Bangladesh border, which, although it doesn't seem like it from the map, wiggles its way so haphazardly across the Bengal Delta around lakes and pukkars and small villages that there is more kilometre of wall than any other border on planet Earth, just because of how much it wiggles. And further east still, you have the India-Burma border, one of the largest walls currently being built. Next slide, please. What's remarkable is that if you go back 100 years today, not a single one of these borders was not just there, but was foreseen. Perfect. There we go. 100 years ago today, in Delhi, you have the inauguration of kind of Lachin's Delhi going on. They're currently building the largest architectural ensemble on basically kind of that the British Empire has ever built. Like Rome intended to last for eternity. Of course, by the time it opens in the 1930s, the Raj only has 1 decade left. But that was not clear 100 years ago today in the 1920s. And around the same time in Kolkata, which was intended to be the second capital of the British Empire as a whole. I think people often forget this. It wasn't just the kind of capital of British India. It was intended to be the kind of Constantinople to London's Rome, the second capital of empire. And you can see it from the scale of the Victoria Memorial. This was intended to be, the successor to St. Paul's Cathedral, mixed but made from the stone that built the Taj Mahal. What I find striking is that we're so used to this natural flow to independence that we forget how unlikely it was considered 100 years ago today. When I was looking in the archives for the famous declaration of Purna Swaraj, complete national independence becoming the aim of the Congress Party, it's actually only on the bottom right-hand corner of the newspaper that you actually see that. It's not considered important news. Far more important, the main story that day, is the fact that the British Empire is planning to reach into space. As you can see, this top right article, where the BBC points its radio waves towards the stars for the very first time and tries to contact aliens. It kind of demonstrates how confident the Raj was at the time. Oh, here we go. Now, the main thing I want you to leave this session with is the fact that the Raj that we're talking about at this point, 100 years ago today, is almost 2.5 times the size of modern India. It's not just India and Pakistan, and this is, I think, the main thing that I want you to leave with. And there's no image that better demonstrates this than this passport, which belongs to an Adeni Jewish woman from now Yemen, who's trying to migrate to Jerusalem. In order to make that migration after the Balfour Declaration, she has to go on an Indian passport because in 1926, Yemen is a part of India. Aden is the westernmost city of India. And again, if you go to, 1 second. Here we go. If you look at the list of princely states, Jaipur, Jodhpur, the 1/3 of the country that was not under direct British rule, but was ruled by Nawabs and Maharajas. In Kerala here, we had Travancore and Kochi being the 2 major princely states. But what we often forget is that the list of princely states opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi and goes on to list other princely states such as Bhutan and Nepal and Dubai. And you can see it in the pictures from the Delhi Darbar when all of the Maharajas go to pay tribute to the king and queen. You have princes from as far as Burma, and on the bottom right, you have the princes of Yemen coming to pay their respects on the elephant behind the Nizam of Hyderabad. They were all relatives. Which way? And so if you put the map of the Raj together 100 years ago today, this is what the Raj looks like. It's far vaster than I think we all tend to realize, and stretched from Yemen to the borders of Thailand on the Burmese-Thai border. And it encompassed 1/4 of the world's populations. Red is direct British rule. Everyone there had an Indian passport, was governed by the rupee, was guarded by the Indian army, and used the Indian postal service. Everyone in the yellow was princely states, semi-independent, but their defense and their communications and their foreign policy was governed by the viceroy in Delhi or Kolkata. And the story that I'm going to be telling you over the next half hour is the story of how this map turns into, there we go, this map. 12 independent nation states emerge from the Raj. It's a much larger story than we tend to realize. And it happens over just 50 years and through 5 partitions, irrevocably changing the map of Asia and producing Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It's a much vaster story than we realize. And it explains the roots of so many of the great conflicts of the day, everything from the Kashmir crisis, insurgency in Balochistan and northeast India, the civil wars in Yemen and Burma, as well as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait during the Gulf War. All of this can be explained by understanding the 5 partitions that tear the Raj apart. And it all begins in Burma, which was the largest and richest province of India 100 years ago today. Today, we often forget this fact. Burma seems sort of somewhat peripheral to the story of modern India, despite the fact that so many people, even down here in the south, notably the Chettiars, when you go to Chettinad, just over in Tamil Nadu, you'll see hundreds of houses made from Burmese teak, hundreds of families who worked out in Burma, and yet we don't really understand how this fits into the national story. And yet, as I said, it was the largest and the richest province of India at the time, and it's commemorated in all sorts of songs. Again, it's there in the background of our cultural memory. Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon is perhaps the most famous Bollywood song that refers to the fact that, so many people were going across. So many, in fact, that the Burmese dream outweighed in the 1920s the American dream. There are more individuals setting sail across the Bay of Bengal than there are across the Atlantic Ocean in search of a better future. Now this, you can see the huge migration that happens nowhere more clearly than in Yangon, erstwhile Rangoon, where in about 4 minutes you can walk from one of the largest synagogues in Southeast Asia, modeled on the one in Kolkata, past the Tamil Hindu Bazaar, past the Chola Dargah, Chola meaning Tamil in Burma, and ending up at the Armenian church. All of this is in a 4-minute walk. There's so much migration, in fact, that the Scotsman begins to write about a growing discontent towards a separation question. This is in the newspaper, the attitude towards whether or not Burma should separate because of basically a Brexit-style conversation. Is all of this migration changing the nature of our society? Are we benefiting from this mass migration? The infusion of money that's being put into our country as a result of being part of this kind of wider union, or is it destroying the fabric of our society? Increasingly, you needed either Tamil or Bengali to get by in business in Rangoon, and Burmese people couldn't get jobs in the city. And so the Scotsman reports this: the attitude towards the separation question is one which strikes deep into the very existence of India itself. If one province breaks loose, no reason can be shown why similar claims by others should not be granted. Again, this is not the story we normally hear. And it divides the country very much down the middle. On the left, you have Mahatma Uttama, Gandhi's main guy in Rangoon, who spends his entire career basically arguing that Burma is an integral part of the Indian nation. He later becomes head of the Hindu Mahasabha and is only voted out in 1937 to be replaced by a certain Vinayak Sarvarkar. And so he is Sarvarkar's predecessor there. Interestingly, he falls out with Gandhi in the second part of his life because Gandhi becomes the leading voice for separating Burma and indeed Arabia. Gandhi's argument is that the Indian nation is not the same as the British Empire. The British have connected all of these random bits through basically imperial conquest, and that the root of the Indian nation is Bharatvarsh, this ancient kind of homeland as set out in the Mahabharata epic many thousands of years ago, and that Indian nationalists should not be seeking to kind of unify everywhere that Britain has conquered. They should just be focusing on this region, which he considered the kind of Indian heartland. On April Fool's Day 1937, the first partition of India carves through the country. Of course, you have the partition of Bengal in 1905, but that just turned one province into two provinces, much as the partition of the Bombay Presidency later would turn Maharashtra and Gujarat into separate provinces. This is the first time that a new colony is being made. Something's being separated from India and being made into, being given a new passport. This is the first time that happens. And these are the stamps issued on that day. And all of this, in the wake of this, you get basically the first partition refugee crisis. It's slightly delayed. It takes 4 years for it to happen. But a anti-immigration politician called U Sow takes power after this partition. He leads a bunch of pogroms against the Indian population in Rangoon, and in particular starts leading a movement against love jihad. The idea of love jihad originates in 1930s Burma, bizarrely. He then basically starts arguing that we need to create a list of all Indian ethnicities that need to be pushed out and exiled. Notably among them are the Bengali community, the Chettiar community, and in particular, the Rohingya community that are, despite being indigenous, added to the list because they speak a language that's a dialect of Bengali. And that's why the Rohingya genocide, that's the justification for the Rohingya genocide just 10 years ago. By the time that the Japanese invade in World War II, we're about a year before Subhash Chandra Bose gets involved and stops all this. One of Bose's least known contributions to Burmese society is essentially stopping the anti-Indian pogroms of the region. But it's because of these pogroms that the entire Indian community decides to flee. In 1941, 366,000 people leave their homes and walk over the hills on foot in what's known as the Long March. This is a photograph that I have from that. My friend Sanvira's grandfather is the man on the left. He later became the first Sikh model for the brand Mossbros, the clothing company. But this is the last photograph taken of his Sikh community in Bordwin Shan state before they were forced to flee. And they posed for one last photograph. Second partition of the Raj occurs at roughly the same time, the partition of Arabia. This is, I think, definitely the most talked about bit of this book, the fact that the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and North Yemen, was a part of India legally, according to the Interpretation Act of 1886, was legally a part of India until the 1930s. Again, it's a story that we don't hear often. In fact, the only reason that Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Bahrain, etc., are not part of Saudi Arabia today is that they were under the protection of the viceroy when Ibn Saud began to unify the tribes of Arabia in the 1910s. In the course of the next, from about World War I to World War II, all of the rulers of the Gulf are sent off to places like Mayo College, Rajasthan. This is the Sultan of Oman, who becomes more fluent in Urdu than he is in Arabic. And in fact, Urdu remains the language of the Omani army until the 1960s. Much of the Yemeni aristocracy actually ruled Yemen from Hyderabad, from Mehdipatnam. This is the Sultan Ghalib al-Qaiti on the right, on the left. And again, this is what Yemeni sheikhs and sultans are wearing in the 1920s. It's not the tobe and it's not the kind of GCC outfit that we're used to seeing today. They are wearing Hyderabadi shirwanis. And the Gulf dress, as we call it today, is actually a modern invention that comes from Saudi Arabia but was alien to the Gulf states until the 1930s, by and large, unless you went inland, basically. And the entirety of the Yemeni aristocracy in the eastern Yemen were all relatives, blood relatives of the Nizam of Hyderabad. So here they all are with the Nizam over there. In fact, Hyderabad was largely regarded, Yemen was largely regarded as a vassal state of Hyderabad state. Now, what's remarkable is that the same conversation about this isn't Bharatvarsh is why this whole area is separated off. But what's remarkable is the British tried to persuade the Indian government to accept the Gulf states. There's a bit I have in the book of the minister of, I can't remember exactly what he is. He's the legation in Tehran, the British legate in Tehran, who writes, "It was with apparent unanimity that government of India officials told us that they did not want to run the Persian Gulf states after the British Raj ended. Basically, the British had offered it, but they thought that it would not make any money and it would be a drain on the exchequer. Of course, oil had yet to be developed, and this was Dubai that year. And Dubai looked a bit different than it does today. Of course, you know, everyone from the Emirates that I've spoken to have said, well, of course, had we been merged into India or Pakistan after independence, it probably would have led to a kind of neo-colonial relationship, and eventually they probably would have got their independence, but like Bangladesh did from Pakistan years later. But it is a tantalizing what if. What if the entire GCC oil wealth had it ended up being ruled from independent India or independent Pakistan? And there are several legacies. Mr. Kimji on the right is today the only Hindu sheikh of the Gulf. He's the Hindu sheikh of Oman of the Al-Banyan tribe, the Banya tribe, who were after this declared an indigenous tribe of Oman. And of course, the Ambanis and their links with Aden were basically forged during this critical period. These first two partitions could have been two of the defining moments of 20th century South Asian history, but they were almost completely overshadowed by the scale of what happened next. And that's because the Great Partition of 1947 remains the central moment, the central event in 20th century South Asian history. And it's one of the most important moments in global history, I would argue, up there with World War II, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Rwandan genocide, the Holocaust. This is the central prism through which 1/4 of the world's population continues to perceive the past, the present, and the future through. Remarkably, I think it's often not emphasized enough that the very idea of partitioning India has its origins in the earlier partition of Burma. The first document in history to mention the word Pakistan is this one on the right. It's the potential Muslim state as envisioned by Rematali Chaudhry, a Cambridge student, included much of Kerala and for some reason much of northern Sri Lanka. The whole thing seems absolutely bonkers, but it's the first time that the word Pakistan appears on paper. In trying to justify the creation of this state, he uses the words, "It makes no sense why, if Burma is to be separated, then the Muslims of India must be forced into an all-Indian federation." He uses Burma's separation to justify a second partition or a third partition. In August 1946, the debates over Pakistan turned violent into Kolkata. I'm sure everyone here knows this history, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But I think that it's important to remember quite how late this was. Until August 1946, there isn't partition violence. This is 1 year before independence. And even as late as July 1947, 1 month before independence, it was unclear where these new states were going to be. And by that, I mean, this is an image from the Hindu newspaper published in July 1946. And the Hindu assumes that Delhi, Shimla, and Kolkata are all going to be part of Pakistan. And this is what they thought was going to happen. And I think it gives you a sense of how rushed everything was. Mountbatten had been given a year and a half to sort out some sort of constitutional future for India and Pakistan by the British Prime Minister. He decided to try and do it in 77 days by 15th August. Why? Because 15th August, Independence Day, was the second anniversary of the Japanese surrender in World War II, and he wanted it done by then because it would make it a nice round whole number. That is why Independence Day is the day that it is. Of course, this leads to the worst bureaucratic nightmare in human history. Entire libraries have to be partitioned between the new states. land has to be partitioned between the new states, and even history has to be partitioned between the new states. Bureaucrats are given just 77 days to divide everything, and when they come, one day they come to the Mohenjo-Daro necklace. This was the greatest masterpiece from the Indus Valley civilization, a beautiful golden thread from about 3000 BC. And crucially, all of the gemstones on it were not from the subcontinent. It represents the trade of ancient India with the world. So they had lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, they had jade from China, they had topaz from ancient Egypt. And it shows who in ancient India was trading with in this necklace. Now, unsure of who should get the necklace, the bureaucrats decide to snip the 5,000-year-old necklace and give an equal number of beads to India and an equal number of beads to Pakistan. So today you can actually see these beads in either the National Museum in Delhi or the National Museum in Karachi. And there's no sign there to tell you that this was once part of one of the greatest masterpieces of the ancient world. And of course, so begins the largest and most tragic forced migration in human history. In the course of just 1 year, you have between 12 to 15 million people flee their homes, with Hindus and Sikhs fleeing Pakistan for India and Muslims fleeing India for Pakistan. Between 1 and 3 million people never make it to the other side of the border. And it's a tragedy that I think lives with us to this day. You go to Delhi, and every family that you meet has a partition story. You go to Kolkata, it's the same. You go to Bombay, it's the same. Amritsar, it's the same. And I think far too often we treat partition as a tragedy that only affected Punjab, sometimes also Bengal. In fact, the most demographically changed state, linguistically, are Tripura and Assam. One of the states that saw the most migration was the third most migration was Telangana, which was, of course, under Hyderabad state at the time. And there is still a part of Karachi today that is dedicated to refugees who came from Chennai. Dosas are there, and, it's basically many people who lived there alongside the Nawab of Arcot. And so it's a far more, I think, subcontinental tragedy than I think we tend to realize. Next slide, please. Now, the fourth of my 5 partitions is based on the fact that Cyril Radcliffe, the lawyer who's tasked with dividing the subcontinent, he's given 77 days to divide British India, only divides British India. And this is the map that he draws. As you can see, it's very different from the image that we have today. So the Radcliffe line is actually applicable to the border of Bangladesh because, as you can see, he kind of draws the border of modern Bangladesh. Crucially, it's not very apt for the India-Pakistan border, where he only draws 18% of the border. The remaining 81% is drawn by the decisions of the princes, the princely states that bordered the region, specifically Kutch, Bikaner, Jodhpur, Jaisalmer, Bhavalpur, Khairpur, and Kashmir. As I mentioned earlier about, next slide, please. Here we go. There were 565 princely states in India. You can see that some were vast, some were tiny. Here are the princes. And there are 3 key states that I want to emphasize which produced major conflicts that run into the present. One, of course, is Hyderabad. This is one of the Qutb Shahi tombs. Hyderabad state, large Hindu majority state ruled by a Muslim majority ruler, tries to go independent, but a communist revolution breaks out in the countryside. In order to put down the communists, he begins relying on an Islamist group called the Razakars, who, as well as attacking communists, begin terrorizing Hindus. Gradually, everything blows up and the Indian army just goes in. There are 3 times more refugees generated in the conflict over Hyderabad state than there were in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. As I mentioned, it was the 3rd most affected state by partition, and yet we very rarely refer to it as such. The second state I want to talk about was Balochistan, the Khanate of Kalat in what's now southern Pakistan. Similar question of, which state should this Khan have joined? He again tries to go independent, but is later pressured into joining the Pakistani Union by Jinnah, the founding father of Pakistan. What I find so interesting is that he'd ratified its independence with his parliament beforehand because it was a constitutional monarchy. It wasn't a pure monarchy. And so the Baluchi insurgency that breaks out in the aftermath is essentially a fight over whether the Khans, being forced into the Pakistani Union goes, or whether it should have been the parliament who wanted to remain independent, who should have had the last word. And to this day, just before the big Indo-Pak war in May, there was yet another massive explosion that derailed a train in Balochistan. This is another conflict that is still ongoing. And then, of course, we have Kashmir. Kashmir was Muslim majority, but with vast Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist populations. It was larger than France, but it had a Hindu Maharaja. Initially tries to remain independent because of the fact, crucially, that Nepal and Bhutan had just managed to get a resolution passed in the Indian legal system that recognized the right of Himalayan states to independence. So the Maharaja of Kashmir, whose attempt at independence is often derided, was doing so on the basis that Nepal and Bhutan had just been allowed that freedom. But of course, and everything initially is fine, but partition violence in Punjab soon slides over the border. There's a massacre of Muslims in Jammu that until this point was Muslim majority. Today, of course, it's Hindu majority. And this massacre of Muslims convinces member of the Pakistani armed forces to go behind the back of their prime minister for not the last time, and for not the last time, sponsor cross-border attacks and basically tried to capture Kashmir and merge it into the Pakistani Union by force. This will not be the last time that the Pakistani military goes behind the back of an elected leader and tries to sponsor attacks in Kashmir. But of course, this forces the Maharaja to accede to Kashmir, bringing in the Indian army, and very quickly you have the Indian and Pakistani armed forces fighting in the high Himalayas. Crucially, I think we often look at this as if these are two well-defined entities at this point. We often call it the First Indo-Pak War. What I think we often forget is that many of the soldiers fighting terrified on the front lines in Kargil had been fighting for one another, with one another, in World War II just 2 years earlier. And one of the most tragic stories that I heard from so many officers who I spoke to about this conflict was that there was basically an agreement that people were constantly lobbying cigarette cartons across the front lines, and these would have letters written to old friends, checking in to make sure that their friends were still alive, whilst then being forced to shoot one another in the daytime. And this is a story that you hear again and again by those forced to fight in the First Indo-Pak War. Next slide, please. So by 1950, the ceasefire in Kashmir has come into effect. The line of control, although it's not called that at this point, has more or less come into effect. And the map of South Asia as we know it has come into effect. The only major difference is that where we now see Bangladesh written on the map, then it was East Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, was carved out of the subcontinent on the basis of where there was a religious majority. And there were two Muslim majority regions in India, one in the northwest and one in eastern Bengal. And although today people often treat Bangladeshi independence as somewhat inevitable, I think it's important to remember that Dhaka is where the Muslim League, the party that forged Pakistan's independence, actually originated. And that most of the aristocracy that later basically formed Pakistan were from Kolkata, notably Suhrawardi, for example. In the election of 1946, Bengal was the only province to vote in the Muslim League. Punjab didn't, Sindh didn't, etc. And so I think it's important to remember that Bengal is actually, in some sense, has more of a rightful claim to kind of being Pakistan than the West. 4 of the first 8 Pakistani prime ministers are Bengalis. This is the first one, Khwaja Nazimuddin. And of course, the early coins of Pakistan look like this. You might notice the Bangla script accompanying the Urdu script. But of course, In the wake of Pakistan's military coup in Pakistan, things begin to go dramatically wrong. Already, there had been a push to try and ban the Bengali language and force Urdu on the population. But that isn't what really gets everyone upset. What gets everyone upset is that when the military coup happens, only 2% of the military comes from East Pakistan. In one fell swoop, you lose the entire political class from Pakistan's governance. And in the course of the 1960s, this man, Mujibur Rahman, comes to massive prominence. He was earlier one of these massive pro-Pakistani politicians, but he becomes increasingly disillusioned by it over the course of his tenure. He's arrested for collusion with the Indian intelligence in 1966. It's unclear what happened there, but it seems that he did reach out to Indian intelligence. There's a letter shared between him and Nehru that recently came to light, hinting that this may have happened, but it's unclear whether he was actually seeking secession from Pakistan or to become prime minister of all of Pakistan. In March 1971, he wins an election in Pakistan, the first free and fair elections with universal suffrage. But the Pakistan military refuses to hand over power, launches a crackdown known as Operation Searchlight, and so begins the Bangladesh Liberation War. I think that far too often we don't realize the scale of what happened in 1971. It is comparable with 1947 and needs to be put alongside 1947 as the year that South Asian politics changed forever. The death toll is famously controversial and we don't really know. Bangladesh would later claim 3 million Bengalis were killed. Pakistan would claim 30,000. That's obviously a massive difference. And neither of these numbers seem to have any real backing, real evidence behind them. What we do know is that the UN registers 10 million refugees in India and Burma in that year. That means that 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians became a refugee. 1 in 12 in the course of 1971. And of course, this all leads to the third India-Pakistan war, where India, who's been backing the Mukti Bahani, the Bangladesh Liberation Army, eventually gets involved in a fully fledged war by December. This photograph is taken after the Indian armed forces have reached Dhaka and with the signing of that pen, bring the country of Bangladesh into being. And I think it's important to remember that this is the 12th of 12 nation states that emerged from what was once one Indian empire. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So in the interest of time, I'll just ask one question and then we'll leave it to the audience. Is it that when you initially started writing this book, you started with a comparative history and then during your research, you found the interconnections of these multiple partitions? Is that when your research deepened that you realized this potential of writing multiple partitions?
So get thinking about questions, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to go to you after I just answer this question. Get thinking, and questions, please, not statements. So just to answer this question, the origin of this book really came, I'd been working on collecting partition oral testimonies for about 4 years when I began trying to get testimonies from the Northeast, which I felt was underrepresented in many of these partition archives. As I mentioned earlier, Tripura was one of the most demographically changed states in 1947, but very rarely gets mentioned. And it was whilst talking with a Tripuri scholar that I got faced with the question, which partition? We had 3, which I found somewhat surprising. I'd been working on partition for years at this point and was muddled by what he meant. And of course, he meant Burma 47 and 71. 3 moments when mass migration changed the nature of Northeastern society. And so, yes, initially, I then was interested increasingly in Burma's partition from India. This is a story, although I'd heard a lot about 71, I hadn't heard a lot about Burma's partition. Initially wanted to do a comparative history. And it was during COVID that I began to read about the Gulf states and their relation to the Raj. initially it was a comparative history, but more and more, I think I wanted to emphasize how it wasn't just that they were comparable, it was that they were dominoes, with each domino affecting the next. As I mentioned earlier, the 1947 partition was the intellectual background of that partition was based off the partition of Burma. Of course, there was all sorts of other things. The idea of Pakistan or of a Muslim homeland had been floating around for decades at this point. But the fact that the first mention of Pakistan explicitly referenced Burma, the fact that Ambedkar, when Ambedkar talks in his book Pakistan about Pakistan and whether or not it was going to happen, he has a whole chapter on the Burma precedent, and yet very few people seem to talk about it. And likewise, I think in 1971, one of the most frequent stories that we hear is it was like another partition. And once again, I think, very few people again emphasize the fact that in the wake of the Bangladesh War, between 1972 and 1974, you did see a comparable exodus with Bengalis leaving West Pakistan going to Bangladesh, with Muhajirs and Urdu speakers and Punjabis all going to Pakistan. And of course, with stateless people like the Biharis of Bangladesh being trapped in the middle. It was actually one of the largest and most orderly population transfers of the 20th century. Now, I know there's a man with the microphone here. Again, please think about questions. We do have 15 more minutes, so everyone will get a chance. Thank you.
I'm Suresh Kumar from Dubai, an Indian from Dubai, what was part of British India. My question, three-part question, quickly, were these partitions inevitable? If not, who you would regard as responsible for it? Second part is, should it have been done in the way it was done? Could it have been done more democratically, played over time, orderly, transfer of population and the like? So who you would pin the blame on, accountability, responsibility for it? And the third part is it possible to reverse it, if at all?
Thank you. Big questions, and I will try to answer them as briefly as possible. First of all, I think, could it have been done better? Yes. Speeding, particularly 1947, which I think was the most in control. Obviously, 71 occurred after a war, so it's a very different sort. But both 37, I think, was done over the course of about 7 years, where they gradually detached things. And still there was an exodus, but it was much less. And it features much less in the imagination. I think that far more the 1947 one, a lot of the tragedy had to do with the time frame, but also to do with the fact that the politicians refused to speak to each other by then. In the wake of Direct Action Day, Gandhi, Jinnah, and Nehru just wouldn't sit in the same room together. And I think we often overlook the fact that there was this huge black market of weapons that occurred after World War II, specifically in Punjab, because that's where all the soldiers were, which is why Punjab was so much bloodier than everywhere else. Were they inevitable? I think that this is the great question. I don't think so. But I think that each partition had a kind of closing doors moment, after which things became inevitable, but before which things could have gone in any direction. With 1947, I think it's Direct Action Day and the bloody killings in Kolkata in August 1946, before which, Jinnah was willing to exist for Pakistan to exist in an all-Indian federation, but after which they wouldn't speak to one another. I think that 71, the turning point is Operation Searchlight, March 71. And I think with Burma, it's the Wall Street crash. I think we often forget that the turning point for Burma's separation to India was that the Chettiar bankers from Chettinad had basically given loans to everyone across Burma. Their loans had single-handedly expanded the agricultural frontiers of Burma and Malaysia and Singapore. Hence, essentially, why Tamil is still one of the national languages of Singapore. It was Chettiar loans, and that's why Chettinad is so full of Burmese-style architecture. But it all goes horribly wrong, because they're the bankers, with the Wall Street crash, it's like 2008. They get rolled out just like 2008. And meanwhile, everyone in Burma goes bankrupt. And the Chettiars, in order to get repayments from loans that go bust, begin taking back loans in down payments in terms of land. And 1/4 of all Burmese land is owned by the Chettiars in 4 years' time. 1/4, and that is the origin of the backlash against the Indians. And so I think that particularly whilst we're here in the South, it's important to remember these ties that tied together areas across the Bay of Bengal. The last questions, is there any hope for the future? I think nationalism is such a force that it's unlikely that anything is going to happen through trying to reverse these partitions through war. I think that some sort of overarching federation, a bit like SARC, economic cooperation is much more likely. But of course, whilst Kashmir continues to be a touching point, I don't see that happening anytime soon. What I think is tragic is that I think India 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, I think had kind of, friendly governments in all of its neighbors. I think right now, India's at a very difficult moment when a lot of the governments it was betting on have been overthrown by coups, by party politics, by whatever. And it means that I think there's less of a chance now than there has been for a while. Thank you for those questions, though. Any more questions? There's a man with a microphone over here.
Hello, Sam.
Hello.
I haven't read your book yet, and hence this question. Much of the writing on the partitions I have read, whether by Anchal Malhotra, Khushwant Singh, or novelists like Salman Rushdie, approaches it through memory, trauma, or narrative. Now, shifting the gaze to shattered land, how does it change? And or how do you navigate this line between memory or trauma of lived ones and historical analysis?
Brilliant question. Thank you. I think the crux of it is essentially I come from a background of oral history, and in terms of memory versus historical analysis, I think it's important to remember that memory is one of the most important sources of history, and that oral history you can treat as a source in exactly the same way that you treat a memoir as a source or a government document as a source. You look for biases, you analyze it using a range of historical tools, but you do attempt to try and basically piece together whether or not this is trustworthy. But also, and I think we're living through a moment now where a lot of these memories are disappearing, and it's never been more important to try and record memories and piece these things down. In terms of how this book, I think, changes the field, I think in trying to broaden things, look at things from a more subcontinental perspective, look at, I think there's fantastic work at the moment happening even here in Kerala and Tamil Nadu and in Karnataka, the huge range of partition stories that come from the South that have been tragically ignored for far too long. You still get people saying that, partition didn't affect the South. And again, you just have to look at Burma Bazaar in Chennai, which of course is founded after the Burma partition from Tamils who came back. You can look at the huge range of Tamils and Malus who ended up in Karachi. There's an amazing book called 1,000 Voices that's been created by the 1947 Partition Archive in Berkeley, California, run by an amazing woman called Gunita. 1/5 of the book is on South Indian stories, and she's got a big what we were discussing quite recently was, I think, the biggest question, the biggest thing that needs to happen in partition historiography is to take the South more fully into perspective and not treat it as an afterthought. But the South, like the rest of the subcontinent, was irrevocably changed by partition. Hence why, when you go to any of the great cities of the South, Bidar, Bijapur, many of these places are in Karnataka. There's a reason why the old aristocracies of these cities aren't there anymore, and that's because they all moved to Karachi in partition. But thank you for those questions. Any more questions? Yes, there's a man at the back over here.
So something which I wanted to ask was, I read an article about the 1971 war, after which when the people from Pakistan realized that they were going to lose, especially among the military, they had contacts within the Indian Army because previously they were part of the British Indian Army. and they tried to, ensure that their loved ones were treated well, things like that. So have you had any experiences like talking to the veterans of both sides?
Brilliant question, thank you. And could we have there's a lady over here who put up her hand, so could we, yes, she's got a mic, great. So yes, I think so many of the interviews that I did, I didn't talk much about the 65 war in my book, but both the Kashmir War of 48 and 71 feature majorly in the book. And I think both times, you get this recurring feature of all of the veterans knew each other. I think Kargil was the first war that India and Pakistan did where the veterans didn't know each other, and it gave a very interesting new flavor to the Pakistan-India relationship, that for the first time the generals on either side couldn't just call each other up and say kind of, old buddy, old pal. And I think, this is one of the great tragedies, again, is how it is one people fighting one another in some sense. I think from 71, the most tragic story, I can't remember who it was. I think it might be General Nagra, who was interviewed by the Observer correspondent, but don't take my word on it, it's in the book. But he's asked, have you met the surrendered Pakistani general, General Niazi, yet? To which he responds, yes, it was so strange to see him. We were friends in college and we fought together in the war. And so it was very weird to, and very tragic to see him when, he's just been fighting for months now against him, forced to surrender. Untold numbers of people have been killed in this war, and of course by the Pakistani armed forces in Bangladesh. And seeing his old college friend in this contact, he talked about was one of the biggest tragedies in his military experience. And again, that's the sort of rhetoric that you just don't get today. Today it's chest thumping, it's we're better than you. It's not old friends talking about the tragedy of this whole thing. But thank you for that question, really good question. Yes, over here.
Is it better?
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually have a two-part question. One is in relation to how a reader perceives writings about the history and all, because as I understand, it's also all about the lens through which you're looking at one particular incident that happened in the past. So as a writer, how do you differentiate yourself in terms of your writing style and your father's, considering both of you write in the similar domain? So your take on that.
Sure. So I think the biggest thing is that my background here, rather than in the kind of medieval period and going through old documents, has been oral history. And I think by far the biggest mentor to me actually has been Anchal Malhotra, who someone mentioned earlier. I think she has probably had the biggest impact. I met her in 2018 for the first time, or 2017, when I was just starting out in oral history. Me and my friends started an organization called Project Dastan, and we were aiming to reconnect divided families, reconnect people who'd been divided by the partition. If your family had a old mandir or gurdwara in Pakistan, we would track it down. If a Pakistani family had a mosque or a haveli or an old school, a place that they went on a first date in Lucknow, we would track that down and show it to people through virtual reality. Anyway, we messaged Anchal, and she, and I want to actually mention both of my co-founders here as well, who are also the biggest influences on me, Sparsh Ahuja and Sadia Gurdezi. Sparsh is currently here, but sadly Sadia Pakistani can't make it. I think that, when we met Anchal for the first time, she sat us down and was like, this is a great idea, sounds all high and mighty, but if you don't do it right and you don't actually get proper oral history training, you're going to traumatize everyone. And she then properly sat us down and basically took us through how to do oral histories and put us on courses, gave us the sensitivity training. A lot of this kind of work requires kind of, dealing with trauma victims always requires a lot of sensitivity. And I think the biggest thing that I think, my father's work doesn't deal with is with people in the present, with trauma victims who you're trying to work with, eke out the story, but also if they don't want to give a story, you don't force them. There are all sorts of techniques about, very often I'll be reached out to by a partition survivor's grandchildren. And when I get there, they don't want to share the story. They've moved past it. It's been 75 years, and you have to respect that. I think a lot of the research on how to go about collecting these type of testimonies has actually emerged from the techniques used with Holocaust survivors. And there's a whole fascinating overlap between how partition scholars are working with memory and how Holocaust survivors are working with memory. But yeah, thank you for the question. Last question. Is there anyone else in the audience? Yes. Okay. Last question. Then we're done.
Hello, Sam. The session was really fruitful for me. So, partition is not a single time event. It's more like a very recurring process, as you said earlier. So, my question is, given India's current political climate marked by increasing polarization and regional exclusion, such as the marginalization of...
Sorry, can you put the microphone closer to your mouth?
Okay. Since current India's political climate marked by the increasing polarization, regional exclusion, such as the marginalization of the Northeast, and the growing North-South cultural and linguistic divide, do you think we are witnessing an early stage of another partition, even if it's unfolding without a formal borders of declarations? It's like, is it a possibility, or is it happening without the publicly?
Brilliant question. Thank you for that. So, I mean, my personal take is that if there's a sixth and a seventh partition, it's much more likely right now to occur in Myanmar, where I could very easily imagine a north and south state quite soon. And I think that, there's not enough focus on what's going on India's eastern frontier, one of the most brutal civil wars. And likewise, Yemen, where I think there was recently a declaration of attempted independence from the south. And I think that we could very easily imagine a South Yemen and a North Yemen once again. In terms of India, yes, I mean, I think currently it's not on the... currently I doubt anything's going to change. India is still very much in control of its borders, but by alienating its own population, by continuing to screw over minorities across the country, not give people a voice, I think that we would be in for a more difficult time. I know that in the South there is a lot of worry about the attempted kind of rearranging of parliament seats, which would give the North, more power than the South. I don't see any danger of an imminent partition anytime soon. And I think that it's if there's one key thing to learn from the past, it's that one needs to be cognizant of how quickly everything had changed if you start basically screwing over your minorities. And I think the fact that one of the most brilliant things that an independent India did, that India needs to be lauded for, was giving languages across India their own states in a way that Pakistan didn't. I see one of the big divergences between India and Pakistan, the way that Pakistan tried to impose Urdu from above and suppress, Bangla, Sindhi, Punjabi, Balochi, Pashto voices. Whereas I think India's most admirable thing in the last few decades has been how, all languages in India, there's more national languages in India than 99.999% of other countries. I think only Indonesia outweighs India in that respect. And so, yes, I think, India needs to be cognizant of how bad things could get if it doesn't start looking after and celebrating its own diversity. But yeah, thank you for that. I think we're out of time, ladies and gentlemen, but thank you for being such a wonderful audience. And I'll be wandering around the festival for the rest of the day. So if you've got any more questions, do catch me. I'm not sure if there's book signings or anything, but yeah. So see you there.